Alors, bienvenue officiellement à cette première journée du FIC Amérique du Nord. Donc, la scène bleue, c'est la scène cyberdéfense et on débute cette journée avec une conférence qui s'intitule « Analyse et quantification du risque, point de départ ou objectif ultime ». Alors, l'analyse et la quantification du cyberrisque sont au cœur de la démarche de gestion de risque d'une organisation. Donc, au-delà de la visibilité qu'ils apportent sur l'exposition de l'organisation, les résultats obtenus contribuent à la prise de décision sur les budgets à allouer à la cybersécurité, sur les solutions et technologies à déployer ou encore sur les exigences en termes de mise en conformité réglementaire. Mais cet exercice, évidemment, est loin d'être facile et pour être efficace, doit reposer sur les méthodologies, outils et techniques éprouvés. Alors, quelles sont aujourd'hui les solutions et méthodes à disposition des responsables de la cybersécurité? Et comment faire de la quantification et de l'analyse du risque un outil au service de leur politique de cybersécurité? Donc, pour cette conférence, je vais vous présenter les conférenciers, mais tout d'abord, juste vous dire qu'il y aura à la fin une période de questions si vous le souhaitez, donc le micro est juste ici. Alors, notre premier participant, Luc Messan, est CISO pour l'Agence française de développement. Madame Piwan Wang est responsable de la sécurité informatique chez BNP Paribas Canada. Et M. Clive Brennan est directeur cyber-risque à la Société Générale. Alors, je leur donne la parole à l'instant. Merci.
Bien. Après cette introduction que j'avais préparée, je vous précise que je suis juste le coordinateur de la présentation de nos deux panélistes. Je vais donc demander d'abord à la dame de se présenter, ses qualifications, le poste qu'elle occupe et puis tout ce qu'elle voudra bien nous dire en cybersécurité et professionnellement, bien entendu. Puyan.
Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Puyan Vong, so we're working for BNP Paribas as a head of information security here in Montreal. Maybe you can hear my accent. I was graduated from French telecommunication school. I started my career as an infrastructure engineer, so really starting at operational level, working on server implementation, data center management and system. As well, I quickly went to IT security. So at that time, I started my career a long time ago already, I would say that. So I quickly went to IT security because it was corresponding to a developing field, a very interesting one. But at that time, we were not talking about cybersecurity. So I was really happy to see the development of this domain and how it was evolving from a world where we were talking about only firewall rules, blocking, or these kind of things, to now talking about cyber risk. So I think this conference will be interesting to talk about that. During my career, mostly at BNP Paribas, so you know this bank. Mostly, I have developed also some expertise in governance management, so IT governance, risk, technology risk management. I had opportunity within BNP Paribas to also be working in Asia Pacific, where I was exposed to some very strict regulatory requirements related to the technology risk management that has enriched my database and knowledge about the way we manage IT risk, technology risk, and cybersecurity risk. So today I am in Montreal leading a team of experts in cybersecurity, contributing also to the strength of BNP Paribas cybersecurity setup here in Americas. That's it for me.
Merci Puyan. Je me tourne vers Clive, auquel je vais demander d'être aussi détaillé que possible et aussi de faire comme l'a fait Puyan, sa vision sur l'évolution de la cybersécurité, donc qui l'a conduit au poste qu'il a aujourd'hui. À toi, Clive.
Sure, thanks very much, Luca. Thanks, Puyan. Hi, everybody. Good morning and welcome to this session. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to be here. So real quick, my background, I work with a French bank called Société Générale. Turns out I'm a serial French bank worker, because prior to that I worked for BNP Paribas. What's unusual for me is I see multiple bosses from both companies in the audience today, which is a pleasure to see. And great to be here. So I work in what's called the second line of defense. If you're familiar with the 3 lines of defense model that we've deployed globally in many companies, I work in the second line of defense, also known as the risk division. What's interesting is I came from the first line of defense with BNP and with SocGen. I'm in the second line of defense. So I get the broad vision of both streams, and it's a never-ending, exciting space to be in, one that I really enjoy. My background before getting into cybersecurity, I used to be a data specialist. I worked in the BI space, business intelligence, for a French company called Business Objects. You may remember it, now owned by SAP. And so data was my bread and butter. What's interesting is when I got into cybersecurity, I realized it's still about the data. Without data, there is no point in cybersecurity. It's the only thing that we're really protecting. It's our key asset. I tested that one time. When I crossed the Canadian border into the United States, the gentleman always asks me, so what do you do for a living? And for years and years, I would say I work in banking. And he would just look at me completely bored. But when I got into cybersecurity and the same question was asked, he would say, so what do you do for a living? And I'd pause and I would say, I work in cybersecurity. And he sat up all interested. I'm not sure what he saw there, but clearly it was more exciting than working for a bank. So I was perfect excited. I worked for cybersecurity in a bank. So that's pretty much me. And your question was, where do I see cybersecurity going? I saw a great one-liner the other day. It said that cybersecurity initially came out as a problem, and then it evolved into cybersecurity management. And now we're moving towards cybersecurity value. It's the end goal. Because ultimately, if we enable the business to do what they do best, and we can add value versus seeing it as a problem or a risk, that changes the tone. The word risk in itself is a bad word, but risk management is a better word. Risk value is a new term that we need to think about. We're in business for a reason. Luke.
Bien, merci Clive de m'avoir facilité la tâche. Le risque est un mauvais mot, c'est le sujet de notre conférence. Pour ma part, qui suis le coordinateur, j'ai commencé, comme certainement beaucoup d'entre nous, par être un technicien. Je développais du code pour les cartes réseau, les cartes de différents équipements. Puis je suis passé chef de projet, réseau. Ensuite, j'ai fait du management. Et puis après un passage dans une école de business management, j'ai commencé à m'occuper des risques aussi, des risques et de la manière de les prévenir. Voilà. Et aujourd'hui, pour rembourser mes emprunts et pour payer mes impôts, je travaille à l'Agence française de développement, ce qui m'a conduit ici, et je vous ferai quelques retours donc sur ce que la vision, la stratégie d'un établissement public et financier. Donc, avec cet empilement de réglementations et de contraintes, qu'elles soient du domaine de la finance, du domaine public, avec naturellement pour la vision internationale que représente l'Agence française de développement, les obligations en matière stratégique de souveraineté numérique que nous sommes obligés de respecter, puisque les clients de l'Agence française de développement sont des États, en Asie-Pacifique, en Afrique, en Amérique latine, etc. Donc, entamons le sujet. Et je vais, si vous le voulez bien, vous lire la définition formelle des risques. Vous savez, en France, on est très formel. Et donc, les agences de régulation ont donné une définition du risque en laissant la porte ouverte aux risques cyber. Et je ne vais pas déflorer le sujet, mais en permettant aussi d'y introduire ce qu'on appelle les risques opérationnels, qu'ils soient les risques dans l'industrie, qu'ils soient les risques dans la finance, ou tout autre. Et donc, je vous lis la définition qui est celle que je tiens pour vraie. Forcément, hein, c'est l'administration qui me paye. Donc, le risque est un risque de perte résultant d'une inadéquation ou défaillance des systèmes, des processus ou des personnels, ou dû à des événements externes. Vous voyez, c'est large, hein, on peut tout mettre. Bon, en fait, on voit bien qu'il y a là le facteur système, l'environnement cyber qui a été évoqué ce matin, qui aujourd'hui se retrouve jusque dans nos poches, qui, avec des appareils qui ont une capacité de stockage et de calcul plus grande qu'il n'en a fallu pour envoyer le premier homme et le ramener depuis la Lune. nous avons chacun dans nos poches des capacités de calcul et de stockage plus grandes, donc avec toute l'exposition que ça peut intégrer. On voit aussi qu'on a la préoccupation des processus, c'est-à-dire du fonctionnement de ces systèmes et du management de ces systèmes. Et on voit aussi qu'on a la problématique des personnels dont je pense, et c'est là une intime conviction, que l'être humain, comme ça a été dit aujourd'hui, mais pas simplement pour des raisons philosophiques ou éthiques, au centre du cyberespace, du point de vue de la cybersécurité, est à la fois le maillon le plus faible, il n'y a pas de pare-feu humain, et à la fois l'élément le plus fort. Parce qu'en attendant que l'intelligence artificielle, bon, nous flattons un peu, on va garder ça, en attendant que l'intelligence artificielle soit capable d'autant d'initiatives pertinentes que l'être humain, je pense que l'être humain a cette dualité-là, d'être l'élément le plus faible et en même temps d'avoir le pouvoir de rester aux commandes pour prendre les bonnes décisions. Donc voilà ma définition du risque, des pertes résultant d'une inadéquation ou d'une défaillance. Je voudrais avoir, Priyan, s'il te plaît, sinon une définition formelle, au moins ta vision du risque.
En fait, la vision du risque, quand on travaille dans le domaine du risque, c'est partout. Sorry, maybe I switch. Sorry, because he was speaking in French, so I continue in English. It will be better. So, what I was mentioning is that when you're working in the risk environment and IT security, the risk is everywhere, from every item, every layer of the company. So, you understood from the introduction that we are working in banking industry, so two very big actors from the financial sector, and so. We'll talk a lot about the financial risk, of course. So the discussion will be about where do we see the risk in IT security and how we manage that in a big bank like ours. So my definition, you have provided a very formal definition. I would say that when we are working in our daily environment and operational environment, we have to make sure that what we are doing every day, what our colleagues are doing, our infrastructure are delivering as services is not holding any risk. So how can we assess that? How can we identify the risk? That's the challenge. So the risk framework should be set up and built up on correct identification of risk analysis, of course, and through assessment to really be clear about where are the risks for the company. Are we talking about only financial risk? Are we talking about operational risk? Are we talking about regulatory risk? All this is embedded in what we are talking about, the foundation of the risk framework. So I would say is a starting point of the discussion. I think, Clive, you will also react to that and enrich this definition and your vision of the risk.
Clive, please.
I'm not sure I'll enrich it, but I'll agree with you, yes. My definition of risk is more simple. For anyone that's studied the CISSP or any cybersecurity exam, you're very familiar with the triad, the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's a Venn diagram. And you come at cybersecurity risk or any risk from those three. So from an information security area, only two of those all three of those are relevant. Integrity, availability, and confidentiality. But from a cyber, if I had to pick one that I'd be willing to compromise in an emergency, it would be availability. I would say, okay, I'm sorry I don't have it available, but guess what? Your data still has integrity, and it still is confidential. It hasn't been breached. So an example would be a denial of service. If someone's coming at me with a denial of service, attacking a perimeter, as long as I can sustain that and make sure that my data still has integrity, still has confidentiality, two of the three are put forth for the business. Ideally, I'd have three, but that's what I think of. Anytime I think of risk, those three circles and how they relate to the business to keep their business going.
Merci. Je voudrais apporter une réflexion qui a été le cauchemar des RSSI en français, CISO en anglais, ces derniers temps. À cause du Covid, le télétravail a introduit un autre risque exponentiel. Et on voit que les cyberattaques se sont focalisées dessus. C'est la porosité entre l'espace personnel et l'espace professionnel. Chacun se retrouvait chez lui, à utiliser ou pas des PC fournis, des équipements fournis par son entreprise, et à utiliser de plus en plus les réseaux sociaux et ces équipements. Donc, nous avons dû, nous, prendre aussi des mesures avec des solutions dont certaines, bon, elles sont françaises, hein, c'est pour ça que je me permets aussi, des solutions qui permettent de mesurer le risque et naturellement d'apporter des solutions aux risques auxquels sont exposées les personnes, les dirigeants, le board ou certaines personnes clés, non pas forcément de la cybersécurité, mais dans les opérations, entre les informations qu'elles peuvent laisser via des mails, via les réseaux sociaux et les éléments qui permettraient de remonter jusqu'à elles. Ça a été très important pour des sociétés internationales qui travaillaient par exemple dans le pétrole, il faut aussi penser à eux, même si nous sommes des sociétés financières, dans des responsables de très haut niveau en matière de finance, dont il fallait protéger un certain nombre d'éléments personnels, notamment s'agissant des contrôles de leurs comptes et de leurs activités personnelles pour, comment dirais-je, les fuites de données, le nom m'échappe même en français, notamment dans les opérations d'investissement, être sûr qu'il n'y a pas d'éléments de corruption des personnes de la banque dans les opérations financières, et cette mise à distance du travailleur par rapport au système d'information, a introduit des éléments de vulnérabilité dans la transmission des documents, dans les éléments personnels qui pouvaient conduire à des éléments professionnels qui ont été pour nous, je ne sais pas si dans la salle on peut avoir des retours, qui ont été pour nous ces 2 dernières années un énorme problème pour le maintien des données et éviter les fuites. Voilà, au-delà de la sécurité des personnes. Nous allons y revenir, mais je vois que nous avons là une approche de la part des 2 panélistes qui sont avec nous, une approche qui est vraiment cybersécurité. La question, je vais la poser, mais le sujet reviendra, c'est de savoir si vous prenez en compte les sources cybersécurité des risques opérationnels, ou les impacts opérationnels des vulnérabilités éventuelles en matière de cybersécurité, et si vous avez, dans les risques réglementaires, pour le cas de l'occurrence d'un risque, si ce sont des choses que vous prenez aussi en compte dans l'analyse de risque. Pouyanne, s'il te plaît.
Oui, bien sûr. Of course, is the answer. You have multiple things that will enter in the identification of risk and assessment of risk. So, if you take an example, you can take a cyber event, something that is happening on the infrastructure, and that you think that is just a technical alert. But if you correlate with another cyber event, you will see that you may have a failure in your infrastructure, and this kind of failure can also open to a breach and can allow some threats to enter your company. So when you're talking about this and the identification, you have to consider your ecosystem. So it's not only to split and just say, I make my assessment on just a certain team, part of the organization or the process. You have really to take into account your whole ecosystem and how it is interfacing with the rest of the world, with the rest of your peers and other companies of the industry. So this is already one point. So we will develop about the risk framework, so identification, assessment and all that.
Ma prochaine question sera pour Clive. Donc, je vous parlais tout à l'heure de la porosité entre le personnel et le professionnel, notamment s'agissant des délits d'initiés. Ça m'est revenu. Alors, il y a un autre sujet aujourd'hui sur lequel la régulation, notamment pour les établissements financiers en Europe, en tout cas, vous pouvez regarder pour les Européens, DORA, Digital Operational Risk Act, donc qui va élever la cybersécurité au même niveau que le RGPD, donc la régulation pour les données à caractère personnel. Et je voulais poser une question à Clive sur comment a-t-il vu ces derniers temps le sujet de la cybersécurité des fournisseurs, des offreurs ou des partenaires, ce que vous appelez en anglais les third parties.
Merci, Luc. So yes, third-party suppliers, that's a space that's dear to my heart and dear to everybody's heart. Let's face it, because of the cloud, because of the economy we live in, globalization, we're going to be using a lot more third-party suppliers which we need to assess. Now, at face value, we look at a third party and we see them as a business counterpart. And because of the volumes of third party, we have to get into a checkbox approach. We firstly send out a questionnaire. And after that, we rely on the human to interpret the questionnaire. But it's easy to see how that can be bypassed. We saw just a few weeks ago, we saw that one of the major Wall Street firms had somebody who was responsible for destroying hard disks, and the third-party analysis clearly had failed because it was a $35 million fine that was handed down to that firm. In that case, it turned out that the company that was responsible for destroying hard disks specialized in moving data, not moving data, but moving furniture and stuff like that. They weren't really specialists in this space. So clearly, when we bring in third parties, we have to look at them as partners in one hand, but also we're expanding the attack surface. So the TPRM, the third-party risk management program that any company has, be a bank, has to be very, very well thought out, and it has to be staffed appropriately. Often I see corners being cut. We bring in a contractor for a while and we let them go, we bring somebody else in and so forth. That's not building a maturity in your business that's going to sustain it. And then what happens is one of them makes the headline, Solar wins, and we're suddenly, oh, let's check how our posture is. So we need to be proactive with third party. We need to make sure that they are partners, but they are absolutely vetted. And there's also a rush to risk accept something. So when we bring in a third party into a firm, the business has an agenda. They want to get their business done. And if the third party that we're proposing brings them in, they have a different agenda to it. But from a cybersecurity perspective, the concept of a risk acceptance is flawed. If you risk accept your third party and you put it in some closet somewhere, you really haven't done much with the risk. You haven't addressed it, you've accepted it on paper, but what have you actually done? So the conclusion is this, that if you do have third parties, which everybody does, take it deadly seriously, see them as a threat, see them as a partner, and deal with it appropriately. And the regulators, to your point, Luke, the regulators are telling us this. You're looking at the regulators and they're handing out more and more prescriptive guidelines. If you take the DFS, for example, which is a New York state law, it was very, very vague when it was written. It was like, take care of multi-factor authentication, take care of this. Now they're revising that law and they're sending us updates throughout the year saying this is the new proposed legislation. And what they're saying is, hey, this risk is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You need to address it, and collectively, as a community, we need to address it. So it's a big topic. I could talk a little bit more.
La prochaine question, Clive, sera aussi pour toi. Puisqu'on reste dans le domaine des fournisseurs, ça a été une grande question pour nous. D'autant que vous savez qu'en Europe, le problème de la souveraineté numérique est un élément essentiel. Le cloud, les fournisseurs de cloud, et la mise dans le cloud, est-ce que ça augmente ou ça diminue les risques? Naturellement, en matière de flexibilité, en matière de capacité, c'est augmenté. Mais pour nous, en cybersécurité?
Great question, Luke. So the cloud is clearly a massive topic. I don't think we have enough time to cover all of the cloud. But let me say this. There was initial fear when the cloud came out that it was this big bad wolf, ooh, the cloud out there. Reality is, if I challenge you to break into this building or into Amazon's building or into Azure's building, Microsoft, which do you think would be easier? The answer is this building right here. They have taken security and they have thrown billions of dollars at security. The cloud is one of the safest places that you can put your data, with a caveat. Firstly, though, think about this. The reputational cost for Google or Microsoft or IBM to have a serious breach of their cloud could be catastrophic to their business. They know this. So they have invested heavily in the cloud space to make sure it is a robust, repeatable place. So for the cloud, yeah, we've expanded the attack surface. But if you look at it, 97% is a number that I saw quoted. 97% of breaches in the cloud are based on one thing, and that is misconfiguration. And so it's not the cloud is the challenge, because we had cloud before. We had our data centers which were not attached to our building. We had to drive down the road to get to our data center. So that's cloud already. So putting them in a different data center known as the cloud doesn't change anything. But if the communication channel between what I'm responsible for and what you're responsible for is not crystal clear, and that's called a shared responsibility model, that's where the flaws are. Each and every item needs to be checked, double-checked, and tested to make sure that it's configured correctly. Because it's kind of embarrassing, and all of these breaches that we see, they're very, very predictable. You look at it, it comes down to human error around the configuration, whereby something that the cloud provider, CSP, was responsible for versus the customer was not clear, and it fell through the cracks. So, in summary, the cloud is not scary, the cloud is a great place to be, but take it seriously and make sure that you configure it correctly as if it was in your own house.
Un retour de terrain de la BNP.
I would say I would like to supplement very interesting what you're commenting on, Clive. The thing is, the cloud is also seen as a solution where we don't have control at all on this solution. Sometimes the service is really seen as a black box. So how can you trust it? How can you put enough control that will make you feel you can be confident on the security of the cloud? That's a challenge. So it's true that we are working with a major player, but again, how can you control that? And when we are talking about risk assessment, risk control, we have to really think about the control we are setting and implementing, and we are able to get and audit maybe ultimately. So I understand this topic about the cloud is really related also to the risk appetite. We have not mentioned about this term, but when we are talking about the risk we can accept or whatever, the concept of the risk appetite is really important. Where do you put the cursor? Are you risk adverse, or do you think that is worth taking the risk? And that's where it is really important to work on the risk framework to make sure that what you see, what the result of your risk assessment and what the risk framework is giving you as information to make decision is really in line with the risk you would like to accept or not. And so the cloud is opening a very interesting discussion because it's not a definitive. So for banks, some banks are more risk adverse than others. For fintech, we talk a lot about fintechs as well. And there's not a definitive answer about the cloud and the securization behind.
Bien, j'ajouterai le point de vue d'un CISO qui gère une administration publique. En deux mots, ou plutôt en une seule phrase, nous avons un problème. Donc, Clive nous a parlé de la garantie des moyens qui ont été investis par les fournisseurs de cloud. Puyan nous a parlé de l'obligation qu'il y a de garantir, enfin de vérifier le niveau de sécurité qu'il y a. Mais pour des administrations publiques, il y en a un autre. Qui gardera le gardien ? Lorsque nous confions des données publiques dont nous sommes redevables, c'est-à-dire le bien public, les actifs numériques d'un pays, les données personnelles, les données financières d'un État, avec nos ministères de tutelle qui sont des ministères régaliens, que nous demandons à certains fournisseurs de cloud, est-ce que nous pouvons chiffrer nos données? Est-ce que vous aurez accès à nos données? Ne vous en faites pas quand vous aurez besoin de vos données ou d'avoir accès aux éléments de sécurité. Vous nous demandez, on vous les donnera. On vous fait confiance. Vos moyens y sont. Mais pour nous, et d'un mot, la question est, c'est pour ça qu'on développe en Europe des clouds dits souverains, mais vous vous rendez bien compte que pour des organismes ou des entreprises internationales, il y a bien un moment donné où elles sont obligées d'aller vers les plus gros offreurs. Nous avons cette question dans les organismes publics, qui gardera le gardien? Non pas d'un point de vue technique, non pas du point de vue des moyens déclarés, mais de la capacité de contrôle que nous avons, nous, sur l'utilisation de nos données par une autre administration ou par d'autres. Par exemple, lorsque nous avons des offreurs qui sont Amazon, Google, Alibaba. Voilà. Donc, il y a aussi cette, pour les administrations publiques, la question par laquelle on commence et on finit pour l'évaluation est aussi celle-là. Tout en étant d'accord avec Clive et avec Pouyan qu'ils ont investi des milliards et ont des moyens que bien souvent les entreprises, y compris très puissantes, ne peuvent pas avoir en termes d'expertise et en termes de technologie déployée et d'organisation déployée pour la cybersécurité. Merci. Je voudrais maintenant, parce que tu as, s'il te plaît Clive, évoqué dans ton introduction le modèle de ligne à 3 défenses. Qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est le niveau de sécurité opérationnelle, c'est le niveau de risque, et puis ensuite, c'est le niveau inspection générale, c'est-à-dire contrôle de l'ensemble de l'entreprise. Nous sommes, en tout cas dans les établissements financiers en Europe, dans une formalisation de ces 3 lignes de défense. Est-ce que tu pourrais nous en dire 2 mots, s'il te plaît, de ta vision des choses?
Yeah, sure, Luke. The 3 lines of defense model you referred to is also known as the Basel model or the Basel model, depending on how you pronounce it. But the 3 lines of defense is, at face value, on paper, it seems very, very good. It's 3 different people with 3 different agendas, 3 different objectives. So the question is, assuming that you put the 3 lines of defense together, how does it work, or what could go wrong that would make it not be so good? So the first line of defense, we're going to call that information security, the guys that are implementing the controls to make sure that things are running. Then in the second line, we have the risk team, the second line of defense, who are overlooking the first line. And then you've got the audit. Now, if they work in a silo, nothing will work. It will basically be, it will just be a bloodbath. So what's really, really important to do is firstly take the first and second line of defense and make sure that they're working effectively. Now notice I don't say the word working as a team because it's not a team. They have different agendas, different objectives. The second line of defense, the risk team, their job is to check and challenge what the first line does. More importantly, the first line needs to appreciate that the second line is not your enemy. They're actually trusted advisors. So if you put a parenthesis around the first and the second line, your job is to defend yourself from the audit team when they come knocking, and they will. The tendency, though, can be that the first line sees the second line as audit, which they're not. So it's really critical that the second line step up to the plate and do this. Firstly, they need to jump over the 50% mark into the front line and say, guys, we see what you're doing, we understand it, and we can prove that because we're technical as well. We're equally qualified in this space. Many of us have come from first line into the second line to make that transition. And secondly, the first line is communicating up to their CISO and up to the board. The first line, let me correct that. The first line is communicating up to the CISO, up to the board. The second line are communicating also up to the chief risk officer. And those stories need to be identical. And you don't do that by looking at PowerPoint slides. You do that by checking and challenge. When I see a metric, I need to know what's behind that metric. When I see a phrase that I don't understand, I need to understand, have you explain it to me so that I can explain to the chief risk officer while you explain that to the CISO. If you adopt that healthy approach, and I'm not saying it's easy, then you have a very effective first and second line working in parallel, somewhat together, but they're not partners, but working together so that when audit comes, hey, we've got this, we've already self-disclosed this item, we're already aware of it. And to me, that momentum of the 3 lines of defense can be very, very effective.
Bon, j'ai pu voir au sourire de certains dans l'assistance que ça sentait le vécu. Notamment au niveau, vous vous en doutez bien, je parle là d'organisation, des frictions qui peuvent exister. On a là une question d'organisation. De qui dépend la première ligne de défense? Clive l'a dit, elle dépend de ce qu'on appelle en français la DSI, la direction des systèmes informatiques. Jusqu'où sera-t-elle objective en matière de cybersécurité si les opérations, les projets prennent le pas sur la sécurité? On a la deuxième ligne de défense qui, elle, est rattachée au risque. Jusqu'à quel point ne sera-t-elle pas vue comme critique vis-à-vis de la première ligne? Et puis ensuite, on a l'audit. Vaste débat. Comment l'avez-vous réglé à la BNP?
comment la régler? Avec enfin, how do we solve that? With people who get the expertise, of course. So Clive mentioned it. It is not something easy. So if you want to have something smooth, that takes time to make it really effective and needs people who knows what they are talking about. So when we are talking about first line, you will always have the image of the operational guy or the technical teams knowing well what is really happening. And when they transmit the information, when the information is going to the second lines with the check and challenge, they will face people really focusing on the risk and risk rating and risk assessment that may lose the sense of the information. So how can we make it work well? It is really through people who knows what we are talking about, and we are using also some indicators. So I think we will come to the discussion about the metrics. So how do we ensure that the information related to the risk from first line come and is translated in a correct way by the second line of defense, and then also reported in a relevant way to the board or to the senior management. That's one of the biggest challenge. And we come to the discussion about what are the risk metrics, what are the risk indicators. Sometimes we have so many indicators we are producing at operational level. How can we keep the sense and the meaning, the purpose of a KPI or an indicators, something that is telling a story about the risk. When you have an ocean of figures, number, metrics, when consolidated, you may have lost the information about the risk.
Ok. Donc, je vais commencer par la finalité de toute cette organisation de la cybersécurité, qui est la communication avec le board ou avec ce qui, dans les administrations, celui qui s'appelle le directeur général, qui, dans les administrations publiques en France, est responsable pénalement et personnellement de la cybersécurité. Lorsqu'on communique avec un board, vous pensez bien qu'on ne va pas lui donner des listes de serveurs avec leurs vulnérabilités. Donc, selon toi, Clive, que doit savoir un board pour prendre les bonnes décisions? Et puis, soyons honnêtes, pour donner les moyens de la cybersécurité.
Great question, Luke. Well, I see a lot of board members here in the room that I'm familiar with, so they could probably answer better than I. But let me put a guesstimate out here what they actually need. So to me, when you're reporting to the board, firstly, the board are highly accomplished executives. They've achieved great things in their career. So they're pretty smart people, and they can smell, something that's correct versus fake news very, very easily. So the one thing that I see is that people are often afraid to give bad news to the board, that they want to sugarcoat the reality, and that's bad from the get-go. It means to me that there's a very transparent communication to the board so that when we have an issue, be it a lack of funding, be it a risk, whatever it's going to be, that the board is fully aware of that. Now again, that needs to be vetted so that we don't overwhelm them, but they want to hear reality. They don't want to hear a sugar-coated scenario. And often I see a rush to get a PowerPoint presentation together for the board, and it's many, many pages long, and the appendices is even longer than the presentation itself. And I often wonder, does anyone actually go home and read this board presentation with all the answer is no, they don't. They're human as well, just like the rest of us. When I worked at BNP, the former CISO there gave me one advice, and he said, dumb it down for a dumb CISO. Those were his words. I said, wow, that's very, very generous of yourself. But reality, his message to me was, when you're presenting to the board, keep it simple. It should be a few pages long, and it should contain the facts that they need to talk about.
À la BNP, de quoi a besoin de savoir le board?
That was interesting because Clive already commented from the BNP Paribas point of view.
D'accord. Donc, une question. Les métriques ont été évoquées par Puyan. Où est le trop et où est le pas assez? Vous pensez bien qu'à partir d'un certain niveau, remonter pléthore, c'est-à-dire un très grand nombre de métriques, finit par amener de la confusion. Ne pas en remonter assez, quel est ton avis là-dessus?
It's a difficult question because sometimes you will have people who doesn't understand well the topic, the domain, that will request more indicators and metrics to say, okay, I have some radar, I have some dashboard, I have indicators, so I will maybe be more in position to make decision and to understand what's going on. But the challenge is really to be selective, to make sure that with these numbers of indicators, we still keep what is making the story relevant and meaningful. So related to this topic, I would say, again, it's not something definitive. And it's maybe one of the conclusions about the risk, cyber risk management, but it's something that you will have to evaluate also with your management. It depends also on their appetite. If you have a board that would like to know all the indicators about the technical things, what is happening on infrastructure, on the information asset side, on the protection you have, you know, we are able to produce it.
Okay.
You mentioned about the
Je voudrais, si vous le voulez bien, nous avons un dernier point à aborder, mais consacrer quelques minutes à des questions si vous en avez. Jean-Michel, si il y avait des questions pour passer le micro ou pas, s'il vous plaît. Il vous suffit de lever la main, un micro vous sera amené. Alors, en général, quand il n'y a pas de questions, soit c'est qu'on a été très mauvais ou qu'on a anticipé les questions.
Vous avez été excellent, en fait.
Merci.
En termes de temps, il vous restait 4 minutes.
Je vais vous passer mon...
Thank you very much. My name is Albert. I'm from BNP Paribas. Thank you very much for the panelists. I was wondering, when you are reporting to the board, are you categorizing your reports based on the integrity, availability, and confidentiality, or you are just giving a total overview?
I can take that question, Luc. C'est bon?
Is that clear?
Okay. Yeah, great question, Albert, and hopefully you can hear me there. Okay. Yeah, so when we're reporting to the board, the guidance we like to do is as follows. It's like, you know, when you're on a plane, you get a little nice box, your whole dinner's right there, everything's laid out for you. You don't need to go anywhere else, everything is self-contained. When you're reporting to the board, that is what you should have in mind. So I would say there's 5 key categories that you would, in general, bring it down to. Number 1, the board needs to know what's the threat landscape out there, what's happening out in the world in terms of cyber threats. Log4j was a great example that made the news, so they're going to have questions around that. The second question they want to know is what we call from the outside looking in. What are the ratings agency telling us about ourselves? So BitSight, Security Scorecard, they actually go through and they give us a rating based on our profile from what's seen from the outside. And these guys go in, they test, or they pen test our networks to see how we're doing. The third category is what we call inside out, how we're looking out to the world, and that relates to frameworks. So how we're doing with DFS regulations, FFIEC, NIST, whatever framework we've chosen to do, how are we doing? Are we 80% there, and what's our maturity level? For the main course, and this is where every CISO or every CEO wants to know, he wants quantification. He wants to know about dollars. He wants to know, what is the cost of my cybersecurity program? He wants to know what would be the projected cost of an adverse event. If we were breached tomorrow, what would the reputational cost be? And if you can't quantify that and put a number on it, it's not useful information. If you say that's very high or medium or it's low, that's nice to know, but he wants to know dollar amounts. And then finally, for dessert, I would give him something to say, hey, your cybersecurity program has got a return on investment. Here's how much we saved by spending money last year. And those are the 5 categories that we put together. And in doing so, he's got a complete picture of the landscape. Hopefully that answers the question.
Merci beaucoup.
En conclusion, que je me permettrai de faire vu le temps qui nous reste, et merci pour la richesse de vos interventions, de savoir si l'analyse de risque quantitative ou qualitative est un point final ou un point de départ. je pense que les panélistes seront d'accord avec moi pour dire que la sécurité est un process continu et qu'il n'y a ni départ ni fin. Ça a été dit ici et là. L'analyse de risque est continue. Et là, une fois qu'on l'a faite, on est à la fin de ce qui a été constaté et au début de ce qu'il faut faire. Je vous remercie pour votre attention et bonne journée.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, merci à Mme Wang et Messieurs Messan et Monsieur Brennan.